December 1944. Camp Clarion in rural Pennsylvania processed its 5,000th German prisoner of war, and among the endless paperwork, mandatory medical examinations, and security protocols, nobody paid attention to a peculiar detail that would soon become legendary among both guards and captives. The Americans served coffee at every meal. Gallons of it, steaming in massive percolators that never seemed to empty. And the German prisoners treated this beverage with contempt that bordered on comedy. What followed revealed something far more significant than beverage preferences. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It exposed the fundamental industrial reality that had doomed Germany's war effort from the beginning, demonstrated through something as mundane as morning coffee. Hauptmann Ernst Kohler had commanded a Panzergrenadier company in the Hurtgen Forest before his capture on November 18, 1944. At 32 years old, he was older than most prisoners arriving at Camp Clarion, a career officer who had served since 1936 and survived campaigns in Poland, France, and 3 years on the Eastern Front before his transfer west. His capture came during the brutal forest fighting southeast of Aachen, where American artillery had pulverized his position for 6 hours before infantry overran the survivors. Kohler remembered the surrender with clarity that never faded. His men had fought until their ammunition exhausted, until wounded soldiers outnumbered those capable of fighting, until continuing meant pointless death rather than military necessity. The American lieutenant who accepted his surrender was younger than some of Kohler's soldiers, maybe 23 years old, but commanded troops equipped with weapons, ammunition, and supplies that seemed unlimited. The journey from frontline capture to Camp Clarion took 11 days. Kohler and 200 other German prisoners traveled by truck convoy to a temporary holding facility near Liège, then by train to Cherbourg, across the English Channel to Southampton, by another train to Liverpool, aboard a Liberty ship to New York Harbor, and finally by rail to central Pennsylvania. The logistics involved in moving 200 prisoners across an ocean and a continent, feeding them daily, providing medical care for the wounded, and processing documentation at each transfer point demonstrated organizational capacity that exceeded anything Kohler had witnessed in German military operations. They fed the prisoners 3 times daily during transport. The food was bland but abundant, portions larger than German soldiers received even before the war, and at every meal Americans offered coffee, endless quantities of coffee, served in canteen cups or disposable paper containers, always hot, always available. Kohler's first taste of American coffee occurred in the holding facility near Liège. A bored corporal manning the mess tent gestured toward a massive percolator and handed him a cup. The coffee was thin, almost translucent compared to the thick Turkish-style brew common in German military culture. It tasted weak, lacking the intense bitterness that characterized proper coffee in Kohler's experience. He drank it because it was hot and he was cold, but the disappointment was immediate. This was what Americans considered coffee? This pale imitation of the real thing? Other prisoners shared his assessment. Lieutenant Friedrich Hartmann, who had served as Kohler's platoon leader before capture, took one sip and made a face suggesting he had tasted poison. This is coffee? Americans don't know what real coffee tastes like. They probably never had real coffee in their lives. The criticism became a running joke among German prisoners during the Atlantic crossing. Guards brought coffee twice daily to the hold where prisoners were confined, and Germans accepted it because warmth was welcome on the cold ocean, but the complaints were constant. Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner, a veteran of 4 years' service who had been captured near Schmidt, declared that even wartime ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns tasted better than American coffee. At least ersatz had body to it, thickness that made you feel like you were drinking something substantial. This American coffee is like drinking hot water with coffee flavor added as an afterthought. Prisoners who spoke English overheard American guards discussing coffee preferences, debating whether the Navy coffee was worse than Army coffee, arguing about which stateside diners served the best breakfast coffee. Germans found these discussions baffling. Americans were arguing about grades of terrible coffee, trying to determine which version of this weak beverage was least offensive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Camp Clarion occupied 300 acres of former farmland in Perry County, Pennsylvania.
The facility had been constructed in 8 months during 1943 and 1944, designed to hold 5,000 prisoners. By December 1944, the camp housed 6,200 German POWs, with more arriving weekly as American forces ground through German defenses along the Siegfried Line. The camp followed Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner treatment. Barracks provided heated shelter, medical facilities staffed by Army doctors and German medical personnel among the prisoners treated injuries and illness. Recreational facilities included a library, sports fields and equipment for various games. Work details provided opportunities for prisoners to earn small wages through labor on nearby farms. And 3 meals daily matched American Army rations in quantity and basic nutritional content. And at every meal, the Americans served coffee. Massive percolators in each mess hall produced gallons continuously. Prisoners could take as much as they wanted. Guards never rationed it, never limited quantities, never suggested prisoners were taking too much. The abundance seemed almost offensive to men who had spent years under rationing systems where even ersatz coffee required careful distribution. Kohler was assigned to Barracks 17 with 60 other prisoners, mostly former soldiers from various Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units captured during autumn fighting in the Hurtgen Forest and during failed German counterattacks near Aachen. The barracks contained bunk beds, coal-fired heating stoves, adequate lighting, and washing facilities that functioned reliably. Compared to field conditions Kohler had experienced throughout 1944, the barracks represented luxury that felt surreal. The first morning in camp, guards roused prisoners at 6 o'clock for roll call, then directed them to the mess hall for breakfast. The meal consisted of oatmeal, bread, margarine, and coffee. Always coffee. Kohler took a cup because everyone else did, and because the December morning was cold. The coffee tasted exactly like the coffee on the ship, thin and weak, lacking character. But it was hot, and there was unlimited quantity, so he drank 2 cups while eating breakfast. Hauptmann sat across from Kohler and loudly declared that American coffee proved Americans had no culture, no appreciation for the finer things that made civilization worthwhile. A people who cannot make proper coffee are barbarians, regardless of their industrial capacity. Look at how much of this terrible coffee they have, mountains of it, oceans of it, and all of it tastes like they forgot to add coffee to the water. The criticism resonated through the barracks. Coffee became a symbol of American inadequacy, proof that despite industrial capacity and material abundance, Americans lacked refinement. Germans had better coffee even during wartime rationing. German culture appreciated quality over quantity. Americans just threw resources at problems without understanding substance. These were the arguments prisoners made, sitting in heated barracks, eating adequate food, drinking unlimited quantities of coffee they claimed to despise. None of them noticed the irony. Kohler noticed but said nothing. He was observing patterns that disturbed him more than weak coffee. The camp routine established itself quickly. Morning roll call at 6 o'clock, breakfast at 6:30, work details departing at 7 for those assigned to labor, remaining prisoners occupied with maintenance duties, recreation, or education programs. Lunch at noon, more work or recreation through afternoon, dinner at 5:30, evening recreation until lights out at 10 o'clock. The structure was rigid but not oppressive, maintaining order without the harshness German military discipline would have imposed. And at every meal, coffee flowed freely.
Guards never questioned how much prisoners took. The percolators were refilled continuously by mess hall staff who seemed to have unlimited coffee supplies. Kohler began paying attention to logistics details that other prisoners ignored. The coffee arrived in large burlap sacks, each weighing approximately 60 pounds. Mess hall staff stored these sacks in a supply room adjacent to the kitchen, stacked floor to ceiling, dozens of sacks representing thousands of pounds of coffee. For a camp holding 6,000 prisoners, serving coffee 3 times daily, the supply requirements were substantial, yet the supply never diminished. Trucks arrived weekly with provisions, and among the deliveries were always more coffee sacks, maintaining stocks that never approached shortage. The same pattern appeared with other supplies. Bread arrived fresh from commercial bakeries in quantities sufficient to provide every prisoner several slices per meal. Meat, though often unidentifiable in origin and questionable in quality, appeared regularly in stews and hash. Vegetables, canned or occasionally fresh, accompanied most dinners. Coal for heating stoves was delivered by the ton, keeping barracks warm through Pennsylvania winter. Kohler had served as a supply officer for 6 months in 1942, responsible for logistics for a battalion operating in southern Russia. He understood supply chain mathematics, knew what was required to feed and equip soldiers in the field. The abundance at Camp Clarion exceeded anything he had seen in German military service, and this was a prisoner of war camp, the lowest priority for resource allocation in any military system. If Americans could supply POW camps at this level, what were their frontline units receiving? The implications disturbed Kohler more than his capture. Germany was fighting an enemy with industrial capacity so vast that even the lowest priority facilities received supplies that would be luxury for German frontline troops. 3 weeks after arrival, a new shipment of prisoners reached Camp Clarion from the Ardennes, captured during the opening days of Germany's winter offensive. These men brought news from the front, stories of the massive attack that Hitler had promised would split Allied armies and turn the tide of war. They also brought fresh complaints about American coffee. One prisoner, an Oberfeldwebel named Wilhelm Graf, who had served with the 2nd Panzer Division, was particularly vocal. The Americans captured us, and the first thing they did was offer coffee. This terrible, weak American coffee that tastes like dishwater. We are fighting for our lives, and they are offering coffee like we are guests at a social function. And the coffee is terrible, absolutely terrible, not fit for human consumption. Hauptmann seized on this as vindication. See? Even fresh from the front, our comrades recognize that American coffee is garbage. They have all the resources in the world, and they make coffee that tastes like they strained it through old socks. The criticism became a badge of honor, a way for prisoners to maintain dignity through cultural superiority. We may be captured, we may be imprisoned, but we still know what proper coffee tastes like, unlike these Americans who wouldn't recognize quality if it was poured into their cups. Kohler listened and said nothing. He was watching something else, something that none of the complainers seemed to notice. The prisoners captured in the Ardennes looked terrible. Not injured terrible, though some were wounded, but exhausted in a way that transcended physical fatigue. They had the hollow-eyed appearance of men who had gone weeks without adequate sleep, food, or hope.
When these men ate their first meal at Camp Clarion, they didn't just eat. They devoured food like starving animals, barely pausing between bites, taking seconds and thirds until guards had to slow them down to prevent illness from overeating. And they drank the coffee. Despite complaining about the taste, they drank cup after cup after cup, holding the warm containers in both hands, savoring the heat more than the flavor. Graf sat near Kohler during lunch on his 2nd day in camp. Between bites of stew and bread, he talked about the offensive. We broke through their lines, drove deep into Belgium. We're going to reach the Meuse River and split their armies. The Führer promised this would be the turning point. But the fuel, we ran out of fuel. The Americans evacuated their supply dumps before we could capture them. Our panzers rolled forward on fumes and then just stopped, out of gas, sitting in Belgian roads like monument to failure. And the Americans? They had artillery firing continuously, never stopping, never running out of ammunition. Where do they get all this ammunition? How can they fire for hours without pause? Kohler asked a careful question. What about supplies? What were German logistics like during the offensive? Graf's expression darkened. There were no supplies. We advanced with what we carried. The horses couldn't move supply wagons through the snow fast enough to keep pace with our advance, not that there were supplies to move. Everything was promised. Nothing arrived. We fought on empty stomachs with ammunition we had to carefully ration, while Americans fired like they had unlimited stocks. The conversation confirmed what Kohler had been piecing together. Germany had launched its last major offensive, staked everything on a desperate gamble, and failed because logistics couldn't support the operation. Meanwhile, Americans maintained prisoner-of-war camps stocked with supplies that exceeded what German front-line troops received. The disparity was so vast that understanding it required accepting conclusions that made Kohler's years of service feel meaningless. Germany had never had a chance. The war had been decided by industrial capacity before the first shot was fired. Everything else was just time until the inevitable conclusion played itself out. Christmas 1944 arrived with snow covering Camp Clarion. American guards erected a Christmas tree in the main assembly area and permitted prisoners to decorate it with handmade ornaments. The mess halls served special meals featuring turkey, real meat that prisoners hadn't tasted in years, alongside potatoes, gravy, vegetables, bread, and desserts. And coffee. Endless coffee, with sugar and condensed milk available for those who wanted to improve the flavor. Prisoners sang German Christmas carols in the barracks, songs about peace and home that carried painful irony for men imprisoned thousands of miles from Germany while their nation collapsed. Kohler drank his coffee that Christmas morning and accepted what he had been resisting since capture. The coffee wasn't weak because Americans didn't know how to make coffee.
The coffee was exactly what Americans intended, a beverage designed for mass consumption, for serving to millions of soldiers continuously without requiring careful rationing or special preparation. It was coffee designed for abundance, not scarcity. Coffee that reflected a nation with resources so vast that even terrible coffee could be provided without limit to the lowest priority facilities. Germans complained about American coffee quality, while missing the significance of American coffee quantity. Quality mattered in a world of scarcity where every resource required careful allocation. Quantity mattered in a world of abundance, where the challenge was distribution rather than shortage. America existed in a world of abundance that Germany had never entered, fighting a war with industrial capacity that made resource concerns irrelevant. That realization settled over Kohler like the Pennsylvania snow, cold and inescapable. He poured himself another cup of terrible American coffee and drank it while watching other prisoners complain about the taste, still not understanding what the coffee represented, still believing that cultural superiority over beverage preparation mattered more than industrial capacity to produce millions of tons of mediocre coffee, still thinking that Germany had lost because of tactical mistakes or strategic errors, rather than simple mathematical reality. Industrial capacity wins modern wars, and America possessed industrial capacity on a scale Germany could never approach. The coffee proved it, one weak cup at a time, poured without limit, served without concern for waste, representing abundance that Germany had never achieved and never could achieve. Kohler finished his coffee and returned to the barracks. Outside, snow continued falling on Camp Clarion, on Pennsylvania, on America, this nation that could afford to serve unlimited quantities of mediocre coffee to 6,000 enemy prisoners while simultaneously supplying armies across 2 oceans. The prisoners would continue complaining about coffee quality for months, perhaps years, missing the significance of coffee quantity. But Kohler understood now. He understood what the coffee meant. He understood why Germany had lost. And he understood that no amount of cultural superiority over beverage preparation could overcome the raw industrial mathematics that had decided the war before it began. January 1945 brought bitter cold to central Pennsylvania, and news that made the cold seem insignificant. The German offensive in the Ardennes had collapsed completely. American forces had recaptured every town the Wehrmacht had seized during the first week of fighting. The Bulge, as Americans called it, had cost Germany irreplaceable losses in men, equipment, and the last reserves of fuel and ammunition that might have sustained defense of the Rhine. Prisoners arriving at Camp Clarion through January and February told stories of total collapse, of divisions ground to nothing, of survivors retreating on foot because no vehicles had fuel to operate. Oberst Martin Steiner arrived on January 28th, a regimental commander captured near Hufeleis,
after his unit ceased to exist as a fighting force. Steiner was 41 years old, a professional officer who had commanded troops since the Polish campaign in 1939. He carried himself with dignity despite circumstances, maintaining bearing that impressed even American guards. Kohler encountered him during evening meal on his second day in camp. Steiner sat alone, methodically eating while surveying the mess hall with the analytical attention of a man accustomed to command. Kohler approached and introduced himself, offering the courtesy due to senior rank even in imprisonment. Steiner gestured for Kohler to sit. They spoke briefly about their captures, about units they had served with, about mutual acquaintances in the officer corps. Then Steiner asked a question that surprised Kohler with its directness. "Tell me honestly, Hauptmann, what do you think of our chances? Not propaganda, not optimistic fantasies, but your real assessment based on what you have seen here." Kohler considered his response carefully. They were surrounded by other prisoners, some of whom clung desperately to belief that Germany could still achieve victory through wonder weapons or political collapse of Allied coalition. Speaking defeatism could create problems even among captured soldiers, but something in Steiner's expression suggested the Oberst had already reached his own conclusions and wanted confirmation rather than comfortable lies. Kohler spoke quietly, choosing words carefully. "We lost the war before it began, Herr Oberst. We just did not realize it because we confused tactical victories with strategic viability. The Americans have industrial capacity we cannot match. They supply prisoner of war camps at levels exceeding what our frontline troops receive. They serve unlimited coffee, terrible coffee, that everyone complains about. And none of us understands that the coffee's significance is not its taste, but its abundance." Steiner nodded slowly. He picked up his cup of coffee, examined it as though seeing it for the first time, took a long drink, despite the temperature being scalding hot. When he spoke, his voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. "I commanded 1,700 men in December. We attacked with 60% of authorized equipment, no reserves, and fuel for 3 days of operations. The Führer promised we would capture American supplies. We captured nothing. American forces evacuated supply dumps ahead of our advance, removing thousands of tons of material that we desperately needed. By the 5th day, my panzers were immobilized. By the 8th day, my infantry was fighting on empty stomachs with ammunition so limited we could not conduct defensive fire missions. By the 12th day, I surrendered with 400 survivors, because continuing meant watching them die for no purpose." He paused, drinking more coffee despite its poor taste. "The Americans who captured us fed us within 2 hours. Hot food, real food, quantities I had not seen since before the war. And coffee, always coffee, pots of it. I complained about the taste like everyone else. It seemed important to criticize something about our captors, to maintain some sense of superiority. But then I watched American logistics. I saw the trucks that brought supplies, the organization that ensured 6,000 prisoners received 3 meals daily without interruption. I calculated what this required: the tonnage, the transportation, the systematic planning to maintain operations without shortages, and I understood what we were really fighting." Kohler felt relief at encountering someone who understood, who had reached the same conclusions without needing them explained. Most prisoners still clung to various forms of denial. Some believed wonder weapons would turn the tide. Others thought political disagreements would fracture Allied unity. Many simply refused to accept that Germany could lose, treating every setback as temporary, every defeat as prelude to eventual victory. Steiner had progressed beyond denial into acceptance,
a more painful but more honest position. They finished their meal in silence, heavy with shared understanding.
Around them, other prisoners complained about coffee, criticized American food, maintained cultural superiority through mockery of American tastes. None of them noticed what Steiner and Kohler had recognized, that abundance mattered more than quality, that quantity was its own form of superiority when dealing with industrial warfare. February brought work details for prisoners cleared by security screening. Kohler was assigned to a farm labor detail, 30 prisoners transported daily to nearby farms where Pennsylvania Dutch farmers needed help with winter maintenance and early spring preparation. The work was outdoor manual labor, cold and physically demanding, but prisoners welcomed the opportunity to leave camp, to do something productive, to earn small wages that could purchase additional items from the camp canteen. The farm where Kohler worked belonged to the Zimmerman family, German-speaking Mennonites whose ancestors had emigrated from the Palatinate in the 18th century. Jacob Zimmerman was 63 years old, a compact man with calloused hands and the practical competence of someone who had worked land his entire life. He treated prisoners with reserved courtesy, neither friendly nor hostile, paying them for work completed and providing lunch at midday. The lunch always included coffee. Zimmerman brewed it in a battered percolator in his kitchen, strong enough that the first taste made Kohler cough. This was real coffee, thick and bitter, the kind Kohler remembered from before the war. Zimmerman noticed his reaction and smiled slightly. "That is how we make coffee, not like the weak stuff they serve in town. My grandfather taught me you should make coffee strong enough that his spoon stands up in it. If you can see through it, it is not coffee. It is brown water." Kohler drank it gratefully, despite the bitterness. One of the other prisoners, a former Luftwaffe mechanic named Dieter Schultz, asked Zimmerman where he obtained such good coffee during wartime. Zimmerman's answer was matter-of-fact. "There is no coffee rationing here. You can buy as much as you want at any store. Sugar is rationed, butter is rationed, some meats are rationed, but not coffee. America grows coffee in Hawaii, imports it from Brazil, has more than needed. Only limit is what you want to spend." The casual statement hit Kohler harder than any propaganda could have. Coffee was not rationed? Americans could purchase unlimited coffee while Germany had been substituting roasted grain and acorns for years? The disparity was so vast it seemed almost fictional. Yet Zimmerman stated it as obvious fact, requiring no elaboration. Schultz laughed bitterly. "Of course there is no coffee rationing. Why would America ration anything? They have everything in unlimited quantities. That is why they are winning. Not because of better soldiers or superior tactics, but because they have more of everything than anyone can possibly use." Zimmerman's expression turned serious. He set down his cup and looked at the prisoners with something approaching pity. "You are right that America has abundance, but you are wrong that abundance is the only reason for victory. Abundance matters because organization allows it to matter."
Having resources means nothing if you cannot deliver them where needed. America is not just wealthy. America is organized. That is the difference. That is why you lost. Kohler wanted to argue, but could not find grounds for disagreement. Everything he had observed since capture supported Zimmerman's assessment. American logistics functioned with efficiency that made abundance meaningful. Having unlimited coffee meant nothing if distribution systems could not deliver it. Americans delivered it everywhere, continuously, without apparent effort. March arrived with warming temperatures and news of Allied crossings of the Rhine. German defenses were collapsing along every front. Soviet forces were advancing through Poland toward Berlin. American and British forces were driving into the German heartland. The war was ending not with dramatic battles, but with systematic destruction of remaining German forces that lacked fuel, ammunition, and hope of reinforcement. New prisoners arrived weekly, sometimes daily, bringing stories of dissolution,
of units surrendering en masse rather than fighting hopeless battles, of Germany's social and military structure disintegrating under weight of inevitable defeat. One evening in late March, Kohler sat in the barracks with Steiner, Hartmann, Schultz, and a dozen other prisoners who had formed an informal discussion group. They met several times weekly to discuss news, to analyze military situation, to try making sense of what had happened to Germany. The discussions were carefully moderated to avoid SS hardliners who still believed in victory and might report defeatist talk to camp authorities or to other prisoners. This particular evening, conversation turned to industrial capacity and its role in determining the war's outcome. Hartmann, who had been captured in November and had watched the pattern unfold over 4 months, posed a question that had troubled him since arrival. How did we not know? How did German intelligence fail to understand American industrial capacity before the war began? We knew America was wealthy. We knew they had factories and resources, but somehow we did not understand what this meant for military production. How did we make such a fundamental error? Steiner answered with the authority of someone who had attended general staff courses and studied military planning. We knew the numbers. German intelligence had accurate statistics on American steel production, automotive manufacturing, petroleum refining, all the metrics that define industrial capacity. But we interpreted those numbers through the lens of European experience. We assumed American production would face the same constraints, the same limitations, the same organizational challenges that limited European industry. We were wrong. American industry operated on different principles, with standardization and mass production techniques that we had not implemented because our industrial culture valued craft quality over mass quantity. Schultz, the former Luftwaffe mechanic, nodded vigorously. I saw this in aircraft production. Germany built excellent fighters, quality machines that performed beautifully when maintained properly. But we built them in small numbers, using skilled craftsmen who hand-fitted components. Americans built adequate fighters in quantities that made quality irrelevant. For every Messerschmitt we produced, they produced 10 Mustangs.
Our planes were better individually, but they lost because numbers matter more than quality when the disparity is 10-1. The conversation continued for hours, prisoners systematically analyzing how industrial capacity had determined outcomes, how logistics had proved more decisive than tactics, how abundance had overcome excellence through simple mathematical reality. No one mentioned coffee explicitly, but the coffee served at every meal had become symbolic shorthand for the larger pattern they were discussing. Terrible coffee in unlimited quantities representing American industrial philosophy, abundance over quality, mass production over craftsmanship, organizational efficiency over traditional excellence. April brought spring to Pennsylvania and Germany's final collapse. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended not with climatic battles, but with exhausted remnants of German forces surrendering to whoever would accept them, desperate to escape Soviet captivity, streaming westward in hope of reaching American or British lines. Camp Clarion processed over 1,500 new prisoners during April and early May, men who had fought until the end and then surrendered when fighting became pointless. Kohler stood in the assembly area on May 8th when camp authorities announced Germany's surrender. Around him, prisoners reacted with relief more than grief. The war was over. They had survived. Eventually, they would go home to whatever remained of Germany. The announcement was brief and matter-of-fact, delivered in both English and German, followed by instructions that camp routine would continue unchanged until repatriation procedures were established. Steiner stood beside Kohler, watching prisoners absorb the news. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. 5 years, 9 months, and 1 week. That is how long it took for mathematical certainty to manifest as political reality. We lost because we challenged an enemy with 10 times our industrial capacity. Everything else was detail. That evening, during the final meal of the war, Kohler took his coffee and drank it without complaint. It still tasted weak and thin, lacking the body and bitterness of proper German coffee. But he understood now what the coffee represented, understood that mocking its quality missed its significance entirely. The coffee was not weak because Americans could not make better coffee. The coffee was exactly what was intended, a beverage designed for mass consumption, for serving to millions continuously without rationing, without shortages, without the careful allocation required in economies of scarcity. Hauptmann approached and sat across from Kohler. He had been quiet since Germany's surrender, processing what defeat meant for his future. He looked at his coffee cup and spoke with unusual seriousness. "I have been thinking about something you said in January, about the coffee's significance being its abundance rather than its taste. I mocked you then because I thought you were reading too much into bad coffee. But I understand now. We spent months complaining about coffee quality while missing the significance of coffee quantity. We maintained cultural superiority over beverage preparation while failing to notice that we had lost the war because we could not match American industrial capacity to produce millions of tons of mediocre coffee alongside everything else they produced." Kohler nodded without speaking. Around them, other prisoners were having similar conversations, reaching similar conclusions, understanding finally what their mockery of American coffee had obscured. The coffee had been a test they had failed, a lesson they had missed, a symbol they had misinterpreted until circumstances forced understanding.
Germany had lost because industrial capacity mattered more than cultural sophistication, because abundance defeated excellence when disparity reached sufficient magnitude, because modern warfare was decided in factories and supply chains more than on battlefields. The weeks following surrender brought administrative processing for repatriation. Prisoners were interviewed, documented, classified by various criteria that would determine when and how they returned to Germany. The process was slow, bureaucratic, infuriatingly inefficient by German standards, yet ultimately effective in managing thousands of prisoners without chaos. Kohler was classified for early repatriation because he held no Nazi Party affiliation, had not served with SS units, and his military record showed no involvement with war crimes. He was scheduled for transport in July, part of a convoy that would return prisoners to Bremen. His final morning at Camp Clarion arrived on July 12, 1945. He woke early, packed the few belongings he had accumulated, and went to breakfast one last time. The mess hall served its standard morning meal, oatmeal and bread and coffee, always coffee, the same weak American coffee he had been drinking for 7 months. Kohler took a cup and sat alone, drinking slowly, thinking about what he would find in Germany. His home city of Dresden had been destroyed by firebombing in February. His family's fate remained unknown. Germany itself was occupied, divided, facing years of reconstruction under Allied supervision. The coffee tasted exactly as it had on his first morning in camp, weak and thin and characterless. But Kohler understood now what it represented, understood that he had been drinking a symbol of American power every day for 7 months without recognizing it. The terrible coffee had been trying to teach him something from the beginning, had been demonstrating industrial philosophy that had determined the war's outcome, had been proving that abundance matters more than quality when dealing with modern industrial warfare. He finished his coffee and returned the cup to the collection station. Outside, trucks were assembling to transport his group to the railway station for the first leg of the journey home. Kohler took his place in line with other prisoners scheduled for repatriation, waiting for departure while around him Camp Clarion continued functioning exactly as it had since his arrival, serving terrible coffee to remaining prisoners, maintaining operations that would continue until the last German soldier returned home. Years later, after returning to Germany, after witnessing Reconstruction, after building new life in a transformed nation, Kohler would sometimes encounter Americans and their coffee culture. He would drink their coffee without complaint, recognizing it for what it was, remembering what it represented. The taste never improved. It remained thin and weak and characterless, exactly as it had been at Camp Clarion in 1945. But Kohler had learned that quality measured in taste was irrelevant when quantity measured in tons represented industrial capacity that could not be matched or defeated. American coffee had taught him more about why Germany lost than any military analysis or strategic study could have conveyed. It had been a lesson served daily in unlimited quantities, a truth delivered in every weak cup, a reality demonstrated through abundance that could not be denied. The coffee was terrible, had always been terrible, would probably always be terrible. But it had won the war as surely as any weapon, proving that industrial power deployed with organizational efficiency defeats traditional excellence every time mathematics allows no other conclusion. Up next, you have got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you will not want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.